Leaning on the everlasting arms. Where do these words come from? In the Church of Christ and in many denominations, this is a long cherished song. Real ones know this song comes from the Mountain Wedding episode of Andy Griffith. These are the darlings right here, and they sing it alongside Andy Griffith. If you've seen this episode, you may know that underneath that wedding veil is Barney Fife. They're about to pull a stunt to trick Ernest P. Bass, was that his name? This song was also recorded by countless country artists, including George Jones and Alan Jackson. This song was in an episode of The Simpsons in 2014. I hadn't seen it, but this song is well known and well loved by countless Christians. Leaning on the Everlasting Arms was published in 1887, written by a man named Anthony J. Showalter. He wrote the lyrics and composed the music of the refrain. Showalter said that he received letters from a couple of students, two former pupils, saying that their wives had died. So when Anthony wrote these letters of consolation, he was inspired by the words in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 27. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 33, if you will. Deuteronomy 33. At the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. So just some context into what's going on here. This is the end of Moses' life. These are Moses' parting words to God's people. If you'll remember back in Numbers 20, Moses disobeyed God by becoming angry and striking the rock with his staff at Meribah. Moses was then forbidden to enter the promised land alongside the older generation of Israelites. In the first chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses said, "Even with me, the Lord was angry on your account and said, 'You shall not go in there.'" Moses pled with God, but God would not change his mind. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, Moses said, "Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country in Lebanon." But the Lord was angry with him because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, "Enough from you. Do not speak of this matter again." And at the end of Moses' life, right before Deuteronomy 33, the last few verses of Deuteronomy 32, God reminded Moses that Moses broke faith. And God reminded Moses that he was not going to get to go into the promised land. How would you feel if you were Moses at this point in his life, about to die, forbidden to see the promised land, after you've led Israel out of Egypt, through the wilderness, up to this point, knowing you were forbidden to enter and would die right outside of the promised land? Maybe bitter, angry, or depressed. Many Bible characters had unceremonious deaths. They died in their worst moments. A handful that I think of are Lot's wife. She's really only known for looking back and turning to a pillar of salt. There's Nadab and Abihu, who offered unauthorized fire to God and then were killed. Absalom, who rebelled against his father and got his hair caught in a tree. Judas, who betrayed Jesus and then ended his own life. Ananias and Sapphira, who lied and were struck dead by God because of their disobedience. These are people who died in their worst moments, and they're remembered for some of the worst things that they had done. Did Moses die in his worst moments? Did Moses die bitter or angry? Absolutely not. Here in Deuteronomy 33, we see that Moses offers a blessing to the tribes of Israel. And Moses, at the beginning of Deuteronomy 33 and at the end of Deuteronomy 33, he praises God because Moses praised God. And because he cared for God's people, his legacy endures. We look back at Moses, and we don't remember him largely for his weakest moments, but we remember him for his meekness and for his faith. When life doesn't turn out how we want, we can look to Moses' example. In his last moments, though things may not have panned out as he wanted, he praised God and he cared for others. Read with me at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 33. Deuteronomy 33. We're going to read verses 26 to 29. Deuteronomy 33, starting in verse 26. There is none like God, O Jeshurun. Jeshurun is another name for Israel, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. Those are the words that inspired the song we just sang, leaning on the everlasting arms. And he thrust out the enemy before you and said, destroy. So Israel lived in safety. Jacob lived alone in a land of grain and wine, whose heavens dropped down dew. Happy are you, O Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph. Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their backs. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. In the words of verse 27 exactly, underneath are the everlasting arms. Let's take a few moments tonight to meditate on the meaning of this truth. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. This means that God is personal. God is personal. God is not just something. He's not an abstract force, but God is someone. God is a person. Throughout Scripture, God is described with human features. He's described as having a face, hands, eyes, ears, and feet. We know as well that God is spirit. So these descriptions of God having human-like characteristics, body parts like arms, a face, and hands, these help illustrate to us his character in ways that we can understand. Underneath are the everlasting arms. When I think of God's arm, that sounds to me like it would be his ability to act. Early in Moses' life, when he was preparing to deliver the Israelites from Egypt by the power of God, this is what God told Moses in Exodus 6, verses 5 and 6. God said, moreover, I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, whom the Egyptians hold as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. God's people were suffering. They were oppressed as slaves in Egypt. Their baby children, their baby boys were being killed. And God told Moses, I'm going to do something about this. God said his arm would be outstretched for his people. And in one sense, for us, God's arm is outstretched. God acts out into the world for our good. But in another sense, in the sense that Deuteronomy 33:27 is communicating, God's arm is underneath us. God acts towards us for our own good. In Isaiah chapter 40, verses 10 and 11, Isaiah wrote this, behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. So verse 10 of Isaiah 40 talks about the might of God's arm. But verse 11 kind of takes a turn and says, he will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. Deuteronomy 33:27, that talks about God's everlasting arms, describes God's arms as being underneath his people. If you're a parent, you know that young children look to the arms of their parents for care and comfort. I don't have any children, but I do know that our dog, Martha May, likes to be picked up and held. She'll jump and put her paws on our legs, and that means she wants to be picked up. King David was familiar with God's everlasting arms. In Psalm 63:8, David said, my soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me. Psalm 145:14, David wrote, the Lord upholds all who are failing and raises up all who are bowed down. God is personal. God catches us when we fall. God lifts us up when we are fallen. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. This means that he knows our needs. He hears us when we are hurting, and God acts towards us to care for us and comfort us. God is personal. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. In addition to being personal, this means that God is powerful. God is powerful. In Job chapter 40, verse 9, God asked Job, "Have you an arm like God?" In Psalm 89:13, David says of God, "You have a mighty arm. Strong is your hand, high your right hand." In Deuteronomy 7, Moses speaks to Israel saying, "Remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand and outstretched arm by which the Lord brought you out." In Isaiah 63:12, the prophet Isaiah recalled God's deliverance of his people from Egypt, saying in Isaiah 63:12, "God caused his glorious right arm to go at the right hand of Moses, who divided the waters before them to make for himself an everlasting name." In Deuteronomy 33, at this moment in time, just a little bit before Moses passes, the Israelites are probably anxious about Moses' passing. Moses was their leader. Moses was the one who led them out of Egypt. He led them across the Red Sea. Moses led them through the wilderness. Moses led them through military battles. Moses led them in the ways of the Lord. Their leader was going to die. But Moses, in Deuteronomy 33, Moses doesn't remind the Israelites of all the great things that he had done for them. Rather, Moses speaks to all the great things that God had done for them. Isaiah said God caused his glorious arm to go at the right hand of Moses. That means when Moses was acting, when Moses was leading God's people in righteousness, that was God working. That was God's strength. That was God's mighty arm. Moses was not the strength of Israel at any point. God was Israel's strength. And though at this time Moses was about 120 years old, he was weak, he was old. Though Moses was old, God was as strong then as he was the day he delivered the Israelites from Egypt. And God, even though Moses would pass, God would continue to love and lead his people. Something we can learn from this: let's not mistake our strength for God's strength. In Deuteronomy 8, as the younger generation of Israelites prepared to enter the promised land, Moses reminded them, and he warned them, "Beware lest you say in your heart, 'My power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth.' You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth." It's God's mighty arm that blesses us today. Every blessing that we have comes from the power of God. Every righteous deed we might do, every good work, or every success we have in this life is not from our power, but it's from the mighty arm of God. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. God's mighty arm cares for us and comforts us. He gives us what we need, and he gives us more than we need. God's mighty arm gives us stability and security. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. That teaches us that God is personal, God is powerful, and also God is perpetual. God transcends time. In Psalm 90, verse 2, David said, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." God doesn't grow old like Moses did. God doesn't grow older like you and I do. The same everlasting arms that upheld the Israelites are as faithful today as they ever have been. God's everlasting arms are underneath us, even through today. God is perpetual. His arms are everlasting. That means he never tires. He will not weaken. Remember the story of when Moses and the Israelites fought against the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. This is the story when Joshua led an army into battle, and Moses stood on top of a hill with his arms raised in the air. In Exodus 17, verse 10, so Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on the other side and the other on the other side, so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. So as long as Moses kept his arms up, Joshua's army would be successful. But in moments when Moses' arms were weak and they were lowered, Amalek started to get a leg up in the battle. Moses' arms became weaker and weaker the longer he held them up. And he had to have two men, his brother Aaron and another named Hur, hold his arms up for him. God's arms do not become weak as he acts towards us. The same everlasting arms that upheld the Israelites are as strong today as they ever have been. God is perpetual, or in the words of Scripture, God is everlasting. It's impossible for us to outgrow our need for God. Alec and I have been teaching from a book written by Aubrey Johnson, and I want to read you something he said about this passage in Deuteronomy 33. He said, "One reason that God's arms are called everlasting is because it is impossible to outgrow them. David said, 'For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in.' The time comes when children outgrow the arms of their parents who must eventually pass from this life and leave them alone to face the world. It is not so with God. From childhood into adolescence and from adulthood into old age, his powerful arms are always there. It is impossible for us to outgrow our need for God." Yesterday, I spent the day in a family play therapy class at John Brown University, and our professor introduced us to this book right here. Here's a picture on the screen. Love You Forever. This was the first time I'd ever become familiar with this book. You're probably more familiar with it than I am. I asked Mom if we had a copy, and she said, "We did get one from my grandma, but I must have just been more interested in Magic School Bus and Dr. Seuss." Robert Munch published this book in 1986. And Robert writes on his website, "One day, shortly after the book was published, the publisher called up and said, 'This is very strange. It's selling very well in retirement communities in Arizona. It's selling in retirement communities where kids are illegal. This is supposed to be a children's book. What's going on?' Grown-ups are buying it for grown-ups. In fact, it turned out that parents buy it for grandparents, and grandparents buy it for parents, and kids buy it for everybody, and everybody buys it for kids. As a matter of fact, everybody buys it for everybody. That's why it sells a lot of copies. Robert says, 'I think it's my best book. So far, it has sold about 15 million copies.'" I want to read you a couple pages from this book. I won't spoil the whole thing for you, but we'll look at the beginning and a page towards the end of this story. So this is the very first page. "A mother held her new baby and very slowly rocked him back and forth, and while she held him, she sang, 'I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be.' And then as the book goes on, the mother's baby grows up He becomes an adolescent, a teenager, and eventually moves out of the house. Towards the end of the book, here's one of the pages. If all the lights in her son's house were out, this is her adult son now, she opened his bedroom window, crawled across the floor, and looked up over the side of his bed. If that great big man was really asleep, she picked him up and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while she rocked him, she sang, I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Isaiah 66 verse 13 says, as one whom his mother comforts, so I will comfort you. This is God speaking. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem. God's everlasting arms are for kids, parents, and grandparents. God's everlasting arms are underneath everyone who has been born again into God's family. God's everlasting arms are underneath his people. God is personal, God is powerful, and God is perpetual. God cares for us. God protects us. He comforts us. He gives us safety. He gives us what we need. It's good to be in the comfort and care of God's everlasting arms. If you're not a Christian, you can be born again tonight into the family of God. We can raise this projector screen up and baptize you right away. If you are a Christian, but you've turned away from God, we want you to come back to him. Whatever your need is, we'd love to help you if you come to the front while we stand and sing.